conference. My name's Dr. Nicola Matheson. I'm the Research Director here at GNET. And we're so glad to have so many people here in person, but also we have so many people online. So welcome everyone. So GNET, for those who don't know, is the academic arm of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism and a special project of the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation here at King's College. So it's been a really big year for GNET. I'm sure you're all aware of the so many reports we've published so far. So we have 7 reports by the end of this conference. So we have 2 conference report launches, which is very exciting when we have them with our authors here today. We've had a gender and online violent extremism series that has come out this year, which has really put GNET on the map as the place to go for all things gender and extremism. We have a gaming report being published tomorrow, a victim-centered approach to counterterrorism measures also launched tomorrow. And starting next month, we're hosting our very first PhD training workshop in partnership with CREX at the University of Oslo. So there's lots of things happening, and this conference is really a culmination of all the things we've learned this year and identifying the trends and opportunities moving forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our illustrious chair of our first panel, Dr. Erin Saltman, and the interim executive director of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And Erin, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Yeah, GIFCT, the other acronyms were taken by the time we made ours. It's a little bit long, I get it, but it is what it says on the tin. Really just so great to see people in person and also to have so many people joined in. I think we have a bunch of people online, so we see you and hear you out in the ether. Everyone take notes for questions. So we have a really nice amount of time. It doesn't have to feel like a rushed panel, which I really appreciate GNET doing because we have 4 very different experts up on the hot seat that are willing and able to take those difficult questions. That goes for you dialed in online as well. I have a nice little fancy pad here that will take your Q&A as well. So we've got both sides of the coin going. GIFCT is a bit of a weird cyborg NGO in that we were founded by tech companies for tech companies and then subsequently became an independent nonprofit. That makes us a bit strange, but when we were founded, it was recognizing that just like everyone in this room, terrorists and violent extremists use a lot of different apps and platforms because they are human, and we are all using a lot of different apps and platforms, and that exploitation of digital platforms manifests in really strange and different ways, sometimes very normal ways, just like how we use them, and sometimes in very unique ways, and it depends on geography, and it depends on the type of violent extremist and terrorist group. And so I'm really pleased that we are able to support an academic wing of our work. And really, the reason for that is that we found that there's usually a strong divide between what tech companies know and what researchers and experts know. And it is our job to cross that divide. And sometimes that means breaking your beautiful 100-page reports and saying, and here's a 2-page summary. And the academics in us are like, oh no, but all the context. And we want to lead people to the context, but we got to start it and break it and modularize it. So action-oriented research is extremely important to us. If you have contributed an insight or a report to GNET before, you'll also know that we proactively let any of our tech companies know if they're mentioned. They're not allowed to kibosh the report, but they are allowed to say if there's inaccuracies. And then we are constantly putting researchers directly in touch with the platforms that you guys are all monitoring so that we keep our finger on the pulse of adversarial shift from both sides, from the tech side and the expert side. And so I really appreciate the work that Nicola and Maddie have done to keep the ground moving for GNET, and then at a higher level that we've got Alex and Shiraz that are kind of leading and charging the way to make sure that GNET keeps on going. It's very important for us to have this sort of action-oriented research. And so just big thanks to everyone. I want to go straight to our panelists. We have the hard task of giving you a light touch and then going into the weeds overview on the current threat landscape online when it comes to terrorism and violent extremism. The new, the old, the weird, the harder to define. And so I think we're going to get a nice little melange on that. And we have everything from accelerationism to what happens with the Afghan withdrawal to misogyny-based violence to Holocaust denial. So we can cover all of this with the experts we have here. I'm going to go maybe one by one and give a little intro to each of you and then have you kind of take the mic. If you have slides, I have one of these fancy clicky things, so you should all be teed up, but I think we'll go Matt, Hannah, Meili, Kabir, and go back and forth. So starting with some opening remarks, and then everyone, please do take down questions and get as obscure and esoteric as you want, because we're here for it. So let's kick it off maybe with Matthew Kriner, who's the managing director at the Accelerationism Research Consortium. And ARC was founded recognizing there was a bit of gap in the consolidated research on accelerationism, where it has overlap with white supremacy today, where it has overlap with fascism today, and some of the trends largely in North America and Europe, but potentially elsewhere in the world starting to bubble up. So let's start with you, Matthew, before going on to our other panelists.
Great, thanks, Erin. Yeah, and I think, you started off by saying there's a lot of the new, a lot of the niche, esoteric even content that's on the internet today. Accelerationism fits over top of that very well. And ARC, as you pointed out, was established with some of our steering committee in the audience here today, the co-founder Megan and John Lewis. All of us sort of recognize that there was this need to put a name and evidence behind some of the trends we were seeing, both from the tech platform standpoint, law enforcement, and then academic standpoint, to understand what was happening in this new realm. And ultimately what we had established and sort of landed on was this idea of militant accelerationism. And we use militant very intentionally. And I'm going to walk you guys through today what exactly that means, and I'm give you a high level starting point so we can all get on the same page, because it is a rather nebulous concept. It can be often conflated solely with white supremacist terrorism, which it very much is in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's viewed as just unique random version of fascist activity. But quite specifically, what we're talking about is a militancy that's put on top of a philosophical concept of accelerating the demise of society. So we go to the idea of what the definition is, and there we are. And what we talk about when we say militant accelerationism, it's not an ideology. I want to be very clear about this. It's not a single ideology. There are many ideologies, there are many mixtures of ideologies, and there's many post-ideological frameworks that exist within what we understand to be militant accelerationism. And that's partially why we started with militancy, because what we're talking about is the use of violence foremost on top of this notion of collapsing society. So it's this set of tactics and strategies that's designed to put pressure and exacerbate these latent social divisions, predominantly in Western liberal democratic society, because this is their chief enemy. This is where they predominantly are hoping to tip the dominoes as things fall. And what they want to do is that you want to leverage violence in order to do that. That's where we get the terrorism. That's where we get that militancy and the violent extremism component of accelerationism. And in doing so, they think they're going to collapse or more rapidly collapse society. Okay, this is the big premise. Now, there's a lot of disagreements. There's a lot of different iterations within that. But if we talk about an objective understanding of what it is, this is probably the closest we're going to get to a consensus definition. And what I want to point out is that this isn't just our term, right? If you see the graphic here on the left, this is actually a document produced by some of the individuals that are the subjects we study, and they themselves refer to the concept as militant accelerationism. They understand the philosophical origins actually stems out of leftist art, leftist philosophy, that, intrinsic values of liberal democracy and democracy as itself, or capitalism. There's something about them that just cannot be self-sustaining over a long period of time, or they might, inherently build these contradictions that make inequity or inequality as a whole in society worse, right? There's some things about them. We know this. There are failures to the systems in which we govern ourselves and we operate our social structures. What their goal is, though, is to militarize those intrinsic breaking points within those systems and, again, contribute to this positive feedback cycle. And like I said, they came up with this term too. It wasn't just us trying to give an academic frame, a new theory that we could publish on in a tier 1 journal saying, oh, congratulations to us, we did it, a new wave of terrorism. No, this is something that's very much a real dynamic and these people actually embrace and believe in. But again, they don't look at it from an ideological standpoint. However, there are very clear ideological elements within. The majority of it is neo-fascist. That is intentional. It would predominantly stems from a group of individuals and that are not necessarily collaborating together to say, we're going to create this, but rather over time acted as proto-accelerationist influences, pillars of ideological thought that contributed to this merging or convergence of what accelerationism is now. And they were all fascists, all of them. Every single one of them. They might have been really, really niche esoteric fascists like we get with Julius Evola or Savitri Devi, if you're familiar with some of those individuals. They might be really hardcore neo-Nazis like William Luther Pierce or Louis Beam or some of the others in the American context, Colin Jordan here in the UK. All of them had a role to play in contributing to what militant accelerationism is today. But it by itself is not exclusively fascist. In fact, there's a lot of individuals that adhere to militant accelerationism that look to blend other concepts, including fascism with communism. They actively think, like Alexander Dugin, that you can blend these things together and create a system of thought that will provide a framework or a bedrock that society will basically collapse on itself from. We got a lot of big ideas. They don't always follow through on, not everybody agrees with them. Don't just take my word for it, right? This is the actors themselves in Telegram talking about what they think militant accelerationism is, how it can work, and what it'll do. And basically, if you notice the forwarded from channel at the top, this actually is a channel in Telegram, like collective of Telegram channels. They call themselves as Terrorgram. They like to embrace the terror moniker. They're openly talking about how those individuals, right, in that space, think that they can collapse society by touching certain little weak points in social structures, and in doing so, creating a positive feedback cycle, right? They shared this all around. That channel that it was shared from, Brandon Russell, the founder of Atomwaffen Division, was recently arrested on a plot to collapse the power grid of Baltimore with another individual. That was his outfit, right? So he was deeply involved in that after he got out of jail. So this graphic really illustrates the principal element. It's meant to have total collapse, and they're willing to go and commit themselves to those acts. And that's why we get a very concerning element of terrorism when we talk about accelerationist violence. Now, how does it manifest? This is really important. There's three main buckets we've sort of identified as the easiest heuristic frameworks understanding how it manifests. The first is this overt in-group identity, who they don't care if they're known as accelerationists. They'll happily stand up and say, I am an accelerationist, I'm a neo-fascist, or whatever else they want to put on top of it. And that's groups like Atomwaffen Division, those that are willing to go out and say, I am what I am, and I'm not afraid to admit it. Then you get a second bucket that's a little closer to infiltration, where they're trying to hide their activities. They don't really want to be seen as exactly that, because they know it comes with public scrutiny, doxes by Antifa, law enforcement activities and arrests. Sometimes it's outright banned in certain countries, like here, if you can't be a part of Stone Creek Division, for instance, that's illegal. So they'll try to hide within or infiltrate other groups and then see these ideas and these tactics and strategies within those spaces. And then the last one is groups like, or set of actions like those that are in the inspired category, which might sound familiar to those of you who've done work on ISIS and Al-Qaeda for the foreign directed and manipulated threats and attacks. This is something that's a little bit closer to that, but in actuality, it's a little more like what we saw in Buffalo, where you have individuals who grasp narratives and ideas, and then on their own, more or less on their own, bring those into their internal views and their own grievances, and then mobilize the violence with very little leakage, very little identification ahead of time, but with a very high impact on society. Gendron in Buffalo was one of the perfect examples of this. He had almost zero interaction with anybody else ahead of his attack, but still managed to go out and commit a pretty good looking terrorist attack from what they were hoping to see. And he didn't actually associate with the first or second bucket, right? So I do want to talk about one of the specific ideological strains, and that's siege culture. Siege culture became one of the most predominant ideological frameworks, particularly under the Atomwaffen Division reign. And it's defined mostly by its embrace of these tactics of small insurrectionary cells, nothing new there. That's been adopted for a long time in the terrorism space. But what they really wanted to do was reinvigorate James Mason's siege text and use that as a framework to spark a race war and thereby collapse society as a whole. Their target, and this is important, was the system, shorthand for Jewish-controlled society, right? They had this deeply ingrained anti-Semitic conspiratorial view. And their ideology was neo-fascist, right? And again, that anti-Semitism. From young ages of at least 12 and 13, those are the earliest we know, individuals were being groomed by older persons in Atomwaffen Division and other neo-fascist networks that are attached to Mason and being brought into this spectrum of hate and violence that they were then brought up in. And as you see in this image here, they would go out and make sort of patronages to Mason in his Colorado home and thereby deepen their ingrained behaviors within the network. The reason this is so important, though, is that it spat out what became probably the most iconic aesthetic. And aesthetics are a very, very important role of accelerationist violence and accelerationist building themselves online. And that was the dark foreigner aesthetic, which is what you're seeing here. Dark Foreigner was an individual in Canada. He's been identified through Vox News reporting, if you want to go and look at that. Basically, Dark Foreigner stitched together every niche element of the accelerationist landscape through one aesthetic. He managed to allow every disparate individual to have one language to speak, and that was through a visualization of what they wanted it to look like, right? So you get these really god-awful graphics of this very clean color palette where you have the blood spattered look right on the left, and they apply it to various different esoteric or deeper references like the order on the right, universal order, which was an old thing from the 70s. And he brings it all together. So you can mobilize many different people under the same framework, right? And in doing so, what we basically get is a new era of digitally based radicalization and output of that into a specific type of violence, which is accelerationist. Looks very similar to everything it's drawing upon, right? Because these are decades worth of content items that are being drawn upon different niche communities like the Iron March community with zero tolerance. But all of it can take many different forms in its output, but it has that one convergence point of the aesthetic that allowed it to really bring out the violence across the different communities. So how do they do it? And how do they do it, I should say, because it still happens. You have two main things, key narratives and mobilizing concepts, right? The first one is this idea that there's no political solution, right? If you believe society should collapse, and you probably don't believe material politics has a way of solving the grievance that you hold. Perhaps it's the fact that you believe capitalism no longer serves everyone. There's rampant inequity between the ultra wealthy and the average person. Maybe your belief now is there's no political solution to that. And then someone introduces a conspiracy theory about the Jewish people. And all of a sudden you now have a mobilizing concept under which you can say there's no solution to my political grievance. Therefore, I must take the fight to the person that's truly doing this to me, which is in the conspiracy theory, the Jewish people. This is where we get things like number two, the great replacement theory and the conspiracy theory. And this is important because of all of the major so-called saint attackers, which I'll talk about in the next slide, the individual mass attackers out of the accelerationist space, almost every single one has had this as a mobilizing rhetoric. Every single one has either openly embraced it or utilized parts of it as a justification for the violent act of terrorism that they committed. We can look to people like Brenton Tarrant in Christchurch, which spurred the Christchurch call, which I think GIFCT is deeply involved with. Most of the tech companies are involved with looking at that content now to understand how it actually manifests on platform. We can look at the Buffalo shooting as well, the Bratislava shooter. Every single one of those incidences has markers of this conspiracy theory. And it's not just them, right? We see this in the mainstream politics as well. So there's a deep reservoir of people they can pull from that might be an attacker of this nature. The next one is the notion of white genocide. This is where the neo-fascist components really get important, is that there is a deep belief that in these communities where accelerationism is present, that white people are fated persons. They are no longer on the trajectory of up, they are now on a trajectory of down, and there are nefarious actors seeking to do this to them. So there's specific conspiracy theories like the white farmers in Africa being, genocided by others there. Those types of concepts are mobilizing people all around the world, regardless of where they are, regardless of which culture they come from. They're able to latch onto this idea because they're having this sort of supranational identity of I'm white, therefore I must protect all white persons. And then lastly, many of them are pulling back to this idea of a European Aryan or Aryan warrior society. This is a relatively new and also very old dynamic, right? It's weird to say that out loud because it seems like it's contradictory, but in reality, this narrative has been around for even before World War II and the rise of fascists, right? This was even early in the 20th century. But what's new about it is it's being injected into these spaces with a pretty strong intention to mobilize people to violence and use that identity structure to merge contradictory or divergent cultural views. So think Norway and United States Southern Dixiecrats, right? People that grow up in Appalachia. Those two views may be completely divergent in a lived experience, but under this framework, they can have one unified concept. And when you add that aesthetic of Dark Foreigner and others, it all starts to merge into one pot that can actually start to feel like a community, right? So you have very disparate identities that can be brought together through these concepts. And then lastly, every single one of these, sometimes combined together, it builds this stochastic mobilization to violence. You don't have to have someone grooming you or radicalizing you directly for this to turn you violent. We've seen this in Buffalo. We've seen this in individuals on a more low-level criminal violence behavior set. no matter where you are in the world, we're seeing individuals pick up these concepts and run with them in a violent way. Almost all of them, we're finding this content online. Almost all of them. And the vast majority of them are getting it from 4chan, Discord, or Telegram. Probably Twitter now too, but hey, that's a different topic. And then lastly, probably the most dangerous overall, and yes, I say this very intentionally, the most dangerous element of these spaces of militant accelerationist violence, it's not the skull mask networks like Atomwaffen Division, it's the individuals that adhere to the so-called saints culture. Most of them are coming out of relative obscurity. They're the ones that lurk in the forums. They do not usually signal themselves as violent actors ahead of time. And they're tapping into a very deep countercultural movement that's seeking to build its own myths, build a new way of being a terrorist, right? And engaging in what is essentially best described as a spiritual warfare from the far right or from an esoteric fascist standpoint. And they're doing so using positive in-group development. They have a lot of out-group development. There's a lot of out-group hate that goes into these worldviews, but most of them are doing it by saying, be a better white man. Stand up and protect your own community. Do what you have to do because no one else is going to do it. The hate only re-emboldens that positive view of themselves and that community they're protecting. And this makes it a little bit new, different overall than what we've seen with other attackers. But you can see in the pictures I have here, two elements that I talked about, that myth making and then the tactical emulation. On the left, you have the Saints calendar. And this calendar, if you'll notice, has a lot of individuals who are quite dead, quite old, right? They're not around today. And the reason for that is that what these individuals that are building these communities are facilitating is a deeper identity construction. They're looking to make this feel more than it actually is. You can co-opt someone that's been dead for 25 years, but did something good back then in their minds, right? Another attack or another kind of ideological marker of in-group positivity, then you can build a deeper cultural experience for these people that are identifying as saints or building themselves into becoming another saint. And on the right, you see the tactical aspects. Even if you decide not to go the route of becoming a new cultural icon like Tarrant or others, maybe you get caught up in rebuilding the exact approach or emulating that exact approach of Tarrant or others in your attack. And we've seen this divergent behavior set coming out of this space, which makes it really, really dangerous because we don't have a really good way of predicting which one's going to be when we look at any one individual that might be giving off some of these indicators. So with that hyper positive note, I will pass.
I mean, this is GNET. We're here to be Debbie Downers a little bit, but maybe in the Q&A, we can ask some questions about what we see tactically for countering these efforts as well. And I know that will be brought up to not all be doom and gloom. We're not just here on that side of the spectrum. But I think I'm already thinking of a lot of questions, and I hope you are too, from what that means for how we think about threat. I might ask everyone as well to touch a little bit about what regions and parts of the world this is most threat-based. That seems mostly North America and Europe for now, although inspiration seems to go far and wide.
Lots in Brazil.
Lots in Brazil. And that might be manifesting somewhat the same and somewhat differently in different ways, I'm sure. And maybe moving on from that, with that nexus point of some of that white supremacy thread, I think maybe we can go over to Hannah Rose to my left and skip around. Hannah is an ICSR research fellow. You've done a lot of work on anti-Semitism. I've been to events that you've helped run just about Holocaust denial and how that manifests in its lightest, seemingly benign version all the way to where that leads to real world harm, and how prevalent that seems to be in the online space as well. But also just your work on broader, what we might term far right extremist terrorism and violent extremism. I'd love to pass it over to you just to talk a little bit about how that's manifesting, what that's looking like in today's world, how much of that language is hidden or coded dog whistling versus really more overt in its aesthetic, and what's prevalent, what should we be worried about right now? I don't know if you have slides or not.
I do. Hi, everyone. Is that working?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to GNET for hosting me and for putting on this conference. I've been asked today to speak about mixed, unstable and unclear extremism, which is a term which is quite puzzling, which is, if you don't understand it, that's why. It's because it's not always understandable. I'm going to try and pick it apart today and show you where I think some of this is moving to, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments afterwards. So this is a term used by the UK government, but it's certainly not an issue based only in the UK. So this is a kind of breakdown of the UK government's type of concern when it comes to categorizing terrorism, which, as we all know here, is not an easy pursuit. So we have Islamist, extreme right-wing terrorism, which our other panelists have spoken about, will do in some detail. We have other, which is a catch-all box for left-wing extremism, Northern Ireland separatism, animal rights extremism, and environmental extremism. And then we have this topic, mixed, unstable, and unclear. So how did we get here? A lot of government policies in the UK and across Europe and North America obviously were created in the aftermath of 9/11, looking specifically at Islamist extremism, and then over the last 5 to 10 years have had to suddenly pivot to an emerging extreme right threat. And I would argue that we need to be pivoting again. There's two main reasons why mixed, unclear, or unstable, or MU, as I'll probably call it, have emerged. One is the general decentralization of the online violent extremist landscape. So whereas we know that 20, 30 years ago, violent extremists were organizing in groups with a leader and you paid fees and you used to go to the pub together, that isn't necessarily how extremists organize anymore. And what this has led to is people logging on, going onto online platforms and engaging in what the FBI has called a salad bar of extremism, which is, again, I would argue, not a particularly accurate term for the idea that we're looking at. So it's been called salad bar extremism, pick and mix extremism, and there's quite a lot of diversity in how we're classifying this kind of content and this kind of ideology, if you will. So we see people increasingly with a whole diverse range of material or engagement with extremist movements, often contradictory, often completely irrelevant to each other. And the system increasingly, when we're looking at prosecutions or policies, increasingly does not know what to do with these people. So here we have what is obviously imperfect data, but the data that we have in the UK from the PREVENT referrals and channel outcomes. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the process, there's community referral. You may then get offered a kind of package of recommendations, which is called channel. So on the left here, you can see for the different new categories, PREVENT referrals, and then on the right, those adopted as channel cases. This is the recent Home Office data, I think, from January 2023. So you can see here a number of mysterious categories, which I will try and explain to you. I should say this is not necessarily a clear picture, it's community reporting, so it's not necessarily explaining what is going on, it's what people think are going on, but that's also interesting and relevant. So first we have the conflicted category, which is defined by the Home Office as a type of concern presented which involves a combination of elements from multiple ideologies, shifts between different ideologies, or where the individual does not present a coherent ideology, yet may still be vulnerable to drawn into terrorism. Quite a confusing concept here. That's what conflicted means in that situation. We have some other confusing categories: high CT risk, but no ideology. So it says there's no clear ideological link to concerns on the referral, but there is a CT risk identified. Similarly, we have vulnerability present, but no ideology. That's where no ideological link to concerns on the referral is present. And then we have no risk, vulnerability, or ideology, which is defined in the same way as the previous category on the Home Office Start Guide. So it's quite unclear what these things mean and how we're categorizing them into different ways. The two ones you may recognize here is school massacre ideology and inceldom. These are increasingly of concern in the UK. I'll show you the next statistics in a second. School massacre ideology, although there hasn't been a recent case in the UK, a number of particularly children, when they are convicted and sentenced in the UK, are found with material which does glorify school shooters in the US, and there is an increased risk of this in the UK, and very little understanding and very little research, particularly of how this relates to terrorism and the aspect of ideology involved in it. And then, of course, inceldom, which, as we probably all know, relates to when a typically young man or boy struggles to have a sexual relationship and expresses that in an extremely misogynistic way in specific online forums. So this is over time, PREVENT referrals by type of concern. This is referrals, not channel cases. That's the caveat. And here you can see how these things have changed over time. So just to explain a couple of areas here, a number of kind of high CT risk, vulnerability present pops up in 2019-20. That's to do with the change in categorization, not necessarily the change in the number of cases. But you can see here school massacre ideology has very much increased since 2018-2019 in terms of referrals in the UK. And incel as a category jumped in the wake of a recent attack, a shooting in Plymouth by a man called Jake Davison. It's not necessarily clear the extent to which inceldom influenced his attack, but it was very much reported as such in the UK. And therefore, I would, in some part, put this down to greater awareness of inceldom among the public, and that accounts for referrals increase. So we can see kind of with referrals, it's actually way outstripping extreme right-wing and Islamist ideologies. However, as you saw on the previous slide, not necessarily in terms of channel cases. So we have quite a mix between what people think extremism is and what it actually is. Here are some case studies that I thought might be quite interesting to illustrate some of the points that come up when we're looking at how we categorize and if we should be categorizing these kind of violent extremists. There was a boy called Jack Reed. He was 15 when he committed his first terrorism offense in 2017, committed various offenses under the Terrorism Act, including preparing acts of terrorism. He was found with various materials, Mein Kampf, extreme right materials, some ISIS execution videos, Al-Qaeda literature. For those of you familiar with the space, no, it's not that uncommon to find Islamist materials among far-right extremists, but it does point to this kind of increasing mixing. And of course, Breivik's manifesto and a couple of other things you might expect to see on someone who is committing extreme right terrorism offenses. He also wrote his own manifesto here, which you can see has a long name, Storm 88, a manual for the practical, sensible guerrilla warfare against the system in Durham city area. Lovely. So you can see kind of in the first 2 paragraphs, the type of material that you might expect to see among an extreme right individual. However, it's not only the case. He also was said by the judge to have an interest in occult neo-Nazism and described himself as a natural sadist. He was convicted of 5 accounts relating to sexual violence and searched online about rape and paedophilia. So here we have this kind of increasing nod towards esotericism, left-hand path occultism, which was noted in his trial. So here we have questions about to what extent do these kind of ideologies get defined within the extreme right bracket. Again, it's not necessarily new or unique that someone involved in extreme right ecosystems is engaging in this kind of occultist material, but do we understand that to be part of the extreme right or an expansion beyond that and a mixing of different ideologies? These are the kind of questions that are coming from this. Should, in this case, if we were to include that in the extreme right bracket, should these kind of sexual offences therefore be considered to be terrorism related? And how does the judicial system deal with that? The other case is a perhaps less known case of a boy, again, who was 15 when he committed his first offence in 2018, called Kieran Cleary. He was convicted of making a potentially viable explosive device and 3 counts of having manuals, so explosive or kind of manuals to commit an attack. He watched videos on the EDL and the Columbine school shooting, used the name White Terrorist online, and watched, in addition to this, very graphic videos relating to cannibalism and a number of other very graphic similar videos. So here again, we have a bit of a mixed bag, and I'll read you something that the judge said during his sentencing. The judge said, "Whilst you do not appear to hold any particular ideology, you are markedly desensitized to such difficult material. The evidence shows you are prone to violence and harbor dark and homicidal thoughts, but it is unclear whether you are motivated by any extremist ideology." However, he was still charged and sentenced under the Terrorism Act in the UK, which begs the question, what is the relationship in, the government's eyes between ideology and terrorism, and how can someone who we don't know if they have an extremist ideology be a terrorist, and how does that impact how they're treated in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of sentence, and in terms of by the media and their kind of life going forward as a terrorism offender? broad stroke, and this is very much a broad stroke, some ideas about the commonalities among all these sorts of forms of violent extremism. And again, I don't think this will surprise anyone. We see this across many different types of extremism: anti-establishment sentiment, anti-government, anti-media sentiment, and this often manifests as anti-Semitism, not only as a specific hatred of Jews, but as a overarching conspiratorial framework through which these people see the world. Matt mentioned it before, the kind of ideas about Jewish people running media, Jewish people running the government, and these kind of often blur together. And often when you are in a conspiratorial framework, you find, you investigate it deep enough and you will find anti-Semitic intent. And then of course, misogyny. So these are kind of some of the, if you like, ideological commonalities, but perhaps we should be looking beyond ideological commonalities. Perhaps we should be looking more at pathways, at socialization, at attitudes towards violence. And maybe it's time we stopped looking at trying to categorize things into neat ideological boxes when they increasingly don't fit. And how is policy responding to this? Well, lots of overarching questions here. As I said, how does terrorism legislation address this changing gap between ideological and violent extremism? When the government definition of terrorism includes a need in the UK, a need to try to effect change, how does that happen when we have people who are kind of involved in violent extremist ideological spaces and don't necessarily know what that change is, and neither do we when we're trying to disengage with and kind of rehabilitate them. There's very, very little research on the risk factors for new extremism and how they differ from other forms of extremism. So social media platforms, for example, what are they looking for? If this is an increasing form of extremism, how do we know what keywords to search for? For school shooters, how, perhaps you could search for some of the names which are very well known in that space, but in terms of keywords and methods and the type of subculture that we see evolving in many of these spaces, it's very difficult for social media platforms to know what to look for when we don't even know what this form of extremism looks like. And through this, we need to build flexible and resilient policies to keep up with the rapid pace of change. For example, the prescription policy, which, as we know, is a group-based policy to ban groups when they appear. But none of the people that we've discussed today are necessarily involved in groups, and they don't have coherent ideologies across different groups. If platforms focus on removing content based on what is banned by governments, then how can the government ban material when it's not group related? And how do we keep those policies flexible and agile, keeping up with the pace of change of extremists? As we saw with the referrals, if that is going to be the government's approach to preventing extremism and using community reporting, for example, how does the public understand the threat? Does the police understand the threat? Does government understand the threat? How can we support that as researchers? And finally, it's a safeguarding question, right? If we don't know how young people are getting involved in these platforms, how do we know how to protect them? So there needs to be a huge piece of research done. Of course, it's a research conference, so I'm going to say more research on protecting young people from getting involved in these platforms and not being so focused on placing them into ideological boxes, which were relevant 20 years ago, but perhaps not so much today. And how do we look at what's going on today and try and work our policies so that they're flexible, not just for today, but for tomorrow and for next year and for the next 10 years. So that's my presentation, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And as you were talking about those ill-defined categories, some of this is not new. Like through my head, I was just thinking of Ted Kaczynski and the Unabomber having a mix of eco-fascism and misogyny and all these other things. And then even things more recently, like the Las Vegas shooter. We still don't know what that was. And that was very premeditated. I still have a lot of questions, so how are we looking at some of those attackers and where they fit? And the point you made, for platforms, we're often talking about a piece of content and that question, like, does this stay up or come down, and on what basis? And when we're talking about this gray area policies, whether it's government or tech companies, they have to be definable, defendable, and scalable. And if we can't define it, we can't build policy around it. So I think you've given all of us some homework, but the more everyone in this room can help us define the space, the more we can actually just have legitimate policy that doesn't over censor. I guess in this space as well, when it's harder to define, over censorship is going to be a criticism in democracy where we come down. So I see some very good questions coming in virtually. I hope you guys are writing some questions down as well in real life. Kind of shifting, we started with some accelerationism and a melange of white supremacy and other violent extremism, and to keep it going and keep us diverse in how we're thinking of the current threat landscape, maybe I'll hop over to Meili, Criezis, and talk a little bit about, I mean, first of all, you're working with a great group as a program associate at the Polarization and Extremism Research Innovation Lab, PERIL. You've done a lot of work on not just Islamic State propaganda, but wider Islamist extremist violent extremism. And you've even done some amazing insights that I've read more recently about even just how this affects the role of women from minority groups in the counterterrorism space, and women of color in particular. I'm sure any female researcher in this room has not only faced different adversarial shifts in getting their own work out, but then being attacked online for being a researcher in this space as well. But maybe you can bring us into what some of the Islamist extremist violent extremism threat looks like today, how that's evolved, and in particular in certain regions not covered so far.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Sorry. I'm like,
We can pull.
it's great to see you all, and thank you, GNET, so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here over the jet lag. But yeah, just to provide some wider context, which I think a lot of us are really familiar with, it's the history of Islamic State supporters online, especially given the wide breadth of which they were really active, especially on Twitter. So back in the earlier days of the Islamic State, when it had its so-called territorial caliphate, a lot of IS supporters were quite active online on Twitter. There have been really excellent reports, right, that have been conducted about, how these individuals have operated in terms of narratives, and just like, how they would actually move from Twitter and go onto other platforms and have that really involved as the recruitment process to draw individuals further into the pro-IS space. So a lot of it first kind of seemed to be really prominent on Twitter, very publicly. But then around 2000, I think 15, 16, Twitter had a massive crackdown on all of these pro-IS accounts, which were really prominent. You had individuals tweeting from inside the territorial caliphate. And so after this crackdown, IS supporters and actual IS members, they realized, oh my God, we don't have this public outreach that we used to have. So what they did was they platform migrated onto Telegram, which has been a really stable, and unfortunately it is continuing to be quite a stable place for them. And so after that huge shift, that platform migration process onto Telegram, that was pretty stable for a while. But in 2019, actually in November, the end of November in 2019, there was a coordinated Europol anti-IS Telegram Europol crackdown day. It was called, I think, Referral Action Day, I believe. And it was like a 3-day intensive, like massive ban. And I remember actually being on Telegram that night, and thank you so much. And all of the accounts started going down, and I was like, what in the world is happening? They're dropping like flies. And then everyone was actually freaking out in these groups, and they were panicking. And it's funny because I kind of felt that same amount of panic as, even though I was there to observe, as a researcher, I was like, oh my God, the data, it's just like disappearing before my eyes. What is going on? And so I was curious what was going on, and it was just kind of instantaneous, like very random. And then I realized this was actually being sustained for over quite a lot of time. And so it was quite confusing to see this. And then eventually my account was banned, and I was like, oh God, goodbye access to Telegram and following this activity. But eventually I was able to keep my account up, and then I went back on there and I saw that they were having massive issues keeping their accounts up too. So what happened was it really encouraged them to be quite experimental and go out beyond Telegram. Twitter wasn't so much of an option anymore for massive outreach. And they started to explore a lot of other alt platforms. And they were basically going out and testing to see which one could possibly be our new home. Where can we find a new area of stability? So, I mean, that process is actually still going on. I see them exploring other platforms. I mean, nothing has really quite caught on like Telegram did. And again, on Telegram, it is still quite prominent. Like that's kind of the place to go for this type of activity, but they're still exploring that. So it really kind of was marking a new period of, we have to find something else where it's more sustainable for us. And so basically what happened is a lot of them still returned to Telegram because they really liked a lot of features, and it kind of highlighted, maybe how extremist actors, using IS as a case study example, what do they prioritize in a platform? Like if you're developing a new platform, how might extremist actors take advantage of your own platform? So some things they like for the IS case, but I believe this can be applied to other extremist groups too, are encryption capabilities. and this is like a difference between like encryption capabilities versus automatic encryption, because Telegram, it has these capabilities, but it's not automatic, which they seem to forget sometimes. It's like, no, when you come on here, it's not automatically encrypted, guys. Okay, but no, nobody tell them, right? So they really do it, like that's kind of a high priority, but they also like the user interface. Like, is it easy to use? Is it very user friendly? Is it intuitive to them? And they've explored platforms that were not as intuitive. And I also went on there, I was like following them, like, okay, let's go see how this works and find out for ourselves, you know, do we like it? And I actually felt like I personally did agree, like, yeah, I don't like this platform because it's not as user friendly. So there's even the very basic thing that even us as, you know, just, you know, online consumers, right? We want platforms that are easy for us to understand. So they kind of gravitated away from those. And they also really like large file sharing capabilities where you can drop MP3s, MP4s, you know, just kind of share a bunch of documents and be able to store and then also download this en masse, because it really is quite annoying to download individually like 300 PDFs, which I've done before. I have to admit I've done that before. It was horrible, versus Telegram where you can like, you know, maybe just have a zip file download, boom, it's right there. Or even have like external links to things like archive, like that's quite often used by them as well. So these are just, I mean, there are more preferences, but these are, I just wanted to highlight a couple. So basically, even after this 2019 effort, I mean, it's still ongoing, the IS account bans, but they are quite stable on there. And then another platform that I've explored more is also on Meta. So it seems like a lot of the English content, at least from my subjective observation, it's quite hard to find. But when you get to different languages like Bahasa, or you're finding other Southeast Asian languages, South Asian languages as well, there are prominent pockets of supporters that are continuing to operate quite overtly. And they even have like, you know, super overt things like an IS flag profile. And I'm like, wow, well, that's bold. Okay, very interesting. I guess you are quite confident. And some of these accounts have been up for like years, even with overt IS profiles. So it's kind of interesting to see these types of accounts. And then of course, Instagram, they are very much on there as well. And actually, particularly, I've seen a lot of activity relating to the camps in Eastern Syria and fundraising. And so you'll see a lot of actually cross-platform linking, where like on Telegram, they'll say, hey, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook. You know, if those go down, come back to Telegram to see the new link. So they are using cross-platform to back up channels and keep sustaining a presence, and, you know, just having that option of like, where can we go once the stuff is deleted? So they are very proactive, and they're very prepared, you know, for when they will face account bans, especially because they're used to it now. Like, it's kind of like molded them into experts on platform evasion and alternative platform testing methods. So on Instagram, it's very image-based, as we know. So the narratives there are really promoted through like images of like women in the camps, you know, saying this is humanitarian efforts. So what you'll see is specifically for fundraising, fundraiser accounts, they'll promote cryptocurrencies, you know, PayPal, they'll disguise the campaigns as well and try to act like it's humanitarian based, but how you know it is actually IS connected is because you only see these links coming from these IS spaces. So they'll say like, this is to fundraise for children. And if it was, you'd see it like, you know, maybe in just non-IS normal related spaces, but it's only coming from these IS spaces. And you can sometimes even track like originally, where did the link come from? And a lot of the times it's coming originally from Telegram, and then they'll put on Facebook, they'll put on Instagram as well. So another type of account, and there's been previous really excellent research done for like, especially Instagram, or sorry, not Instagram, for Twitter, but yeah, there are types of accounts and they often overlap. So one type was, you know, the fundraisers. There's also, of course, propagandists who focus on, you know, pushing out pro-IS, but also official IS content. And there's continuing to be a huge focus on ongoing multilingual projects, and they actually designate specific tasks to people. You'll find them saying, hey, you know, this account, you need to translate this, and I want this back in an X number of days. So it's like these guys are getting their homework from these unofficial IS translation coordinators. Then there's also networkers, which are focusing on specifically for Facebook, for example, they are focusing on connecting new accounts that are coming into the IS space, or they'll say, hey, this, you know, this sister has been banned 20 times. Here's a new account. Everyone go follow her. So these networkers help each other just like connect with one another. Then you'll have personal accounts, which are people that could be classified as not really wanting to be super activist in terms of linking or, you know, helping each other link up, or, you know, propagandizing, because that comes with a ban risk, right? So these people just want to have their personal accounts. They want to privately connect with other IS supporters, and they don't really do anything that could get them banned. They just connect. So that's, you can just see like they are pro-IS by their friend Facebook list and go, okay, wow, that is definitely, I can tell what type of account this is, even though they will post like, you know, normal content. So, and then there's also, yeah, fundraisers networks. And then again, there's like these different categories come with different risk of being banned. So it's kind of a strategic question of, balancing what is the objective? Is it propagandizing? Is it just keeping your account up as long as possible as an IS supporter? Or is it worth being banned? So it's kind of having to balance this, what they want to do. And so I think it like definitely merits, further research into, types of accounts that are existing on different platforms. What are the similarities of categories of accounts on like, Facebook versus Instagram versus Telegram, and also other platforms that I haven't named. But, just seeing how consistent are these and how do the platforms themselves also like have an influence in transforming the behaviors, and how platform specific are these behaviors. And then finally, there's also more recent development, which colleagues have already talked about like, aesthetic blending, possibly accelerationist connected accounts. And so for Salafi jihadist spaces, there are a handful of accounts that I'm or channels on Telegram that I'm following that are actually exhibiting ideological overlaps. So what they'll do is they try to have the appearance of being a normal Salafi jihadist channel, but you'll see certain points in the messaging where you can tell this is not actually the type of Salafi jihadist channel that that is typical among these supporters. And they'll slowly start injecting, sometimes rather boldly, it just depends, but they'll start injecting white supremacist rhetoric. They'll talk about, traditionalism. They'll bring in more like esoteric properties, and they'll try to blend this with like, Islamic State propaganda. And by pretending to be Salafi jihadist supporters, they'll try to pull people into this via like Discord, Telegram especially. And it's interesting because I have seen cases where there are individuals who think they're in a Salafi jihadist space, but then they are realizing like, wait, this is kind of odd, but then they get hooked. They become interested in it. So maybe they start off being interested in Salafi jihadism, but when they see these other elements coming in, they're like, hey, what's this? This is an interesting flavor. Let's check it out. I'm not against it. So these are people that are usually not very familiar with the more like typical kind of like, very categorized, strict ideological background from like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, and they're willing to have like malleable ideological edges, so this is the type of audience that these type of channels can take advantage. And so again, it's also good to pay attention to the evasion strategies, which also vary from platform to platform, and they can remain the same as well. They can have commonalities as well. So yeah, that's just kind of an overview, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. And I think what your talk, as you were discussing these points, we often in our space other the terrorist and violent extremist, just as they have in-groups and out-groups. I think we as researchers usually put in a box the type of person that might become a terrorist or violent extremist. But you've very much humanized just their activity and how they work as a social network in the online space. I think we also forget there tends to be a different type of mental profile between lone actors and group joiners, and that group joiners tend to have very normative profiles, and just that human of like, well, where would I go? What's my favorite app? Ooh, this one's easy. I like this. This makes my life easier. And we're all using platforms to make things easier, faster, cheaper, quicker, all those different things. So that gives us a real sense of just the human side of working towards your aim in the online space. So thank you for that. And it's very helpful and very practical for us to pass this sort of thing on to tech companies to understand what that signal might then manifest as. Last but certainly not least, and really helpful to kind of carry on from that thread in focusing on not just Islamist, extremist, transnational terrorism, but some of the wider boxes that we might be looking at in other parts of the world. Kabir Taneja is a fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, ORF, in India, and has focused a lot of research on West Asia, a lot on transnational terrorism, on Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, but also has done some really innovative work on just what the Taliban has looked like post-Afghan withdrawal, and whether or not we bucket that as terrorism according to governments or according to tech platforms. So maybe I can pass it over to you to talk a little bit more about those trends in West Asia, what you're seeing as threat, where you have most concern right now. And again, thank you for those of you virtually sending in questions. Don't worry, we won't forget about that, and we'll get to that after this talk.
All right, thanks, Erin. Always good to be back for a GNET event, and it's great to see how big the classroom has become now. Maybe that's not such a great thing, I don't know. Yeah, so I'll just, it's been an illuminating panel till now. I got to learn a lot of things, and for my part, I'll take you back to a place where I think a lot of people had hoped is now done with, or there's not enough happening from a global perspective. which may be true, but there's a lot happening from a regional perspective now. So the takeover of the Taliban in August 21 had severe regional implications on both domestic terrorism and transnational terrorism. And the digital space has actually become much more active on the regional front than it has ever been before. So while we may have seen sort of a level of normalization of how we look at the Taliban now, or how we consume what they're saying, considering it's till a certain extent freely available, especially on Twitter, not so much on some other platforms, but Twitter is certainly something that they are very effectively using to legitimize what they started in August. And it is at the forefront of how they want to portray the Islamic Emirate now, because they know that all of us read that and only that. So they communicate a completely different way within Afghanistan and with Afghans to what is perceived and portrayed to us. So the first part, most of us will never get to read or hear anymore because it is so tightly controlled. The second part is designed for us, so we will be largely consuming that for the foreseeable future. And this comes, I think, from not from something that they have developed after they came to power. So I don't know if people remember the images that came on Al Jazeera on 15th August, when they entered the palaces in Kabul and stuff like that. There were more people with cameras than with guns, especially with mobile phones. So they knew that, you know, how they are portrayed in the coming few months on social media specifically is going to be critical on how much solidification they can do of their Islamic Emirate. So let me just start with sort of how the leadership and the institutions are looking at communication online. As I said, Twitter is at the forefront and has been for a long period of time. Most of their interim ministers have Twitter accounts, communicate largely through their Twitter accounts. And what we consume and what we understand of what the Taliban is today and what Afghanistan is under the Taliban is what we read from those Twitter accounts. So they have a very strong grasp in narrating what Afghanistan is now. And of course, one of their favorite things to say is that it is now calm, there's no war, and that is something that the Afghan people are extremely, extremely happy about. I'm not sure how they know that they're extremely happy about, since we don't really hear the Afghan people anymore. But it is also sort of odd that they're bragging about that, considering they were the ones conducting the conflict. But, you know, so what we have realized of how they have strategized themselves is digital for the outside and analog for the inside. Now, the Taliban is, of course, has been very effective communicator since the 90s. It's just that there was no internet back then. Well, there was, but there were no, the platforms were not so easily available back then. But how they sort of approach the digital frameworks now is largely on two fronts. The first I've already discussed, which is what we read. The second is, of course, the Taliban is a fractured movement. So it's also what their colleagues read. We've seen over the recent past, there's been a lot of talk about how education should be dealt with in Afghanistan with the Taliban. And if you go deep into not just the accounts that the interim government runs, but if you go deep into the accounts now run by ideologues and Islamic scholars within Afghanistan, there's a massive debate on Twitter. A lot of them say that it is not un-Islamic, that women and girls go to school, women go to jobs, and so on and so forth, while the other section says it is un-Islamic. So this is happening in a very free and open social media system. And that is largely because Twitter is not something they can control. If they could, they probably would have done it by now. But it shows that there are avenues that are being used by the Taliban itself to showcase dissent within their movement, which is not very common for a movement like the Taliban. And because of this now, we see a whole diverse section within the Taliban that support girls' education, whether they like it or not, because they realize now that is attached to the stability of the Islamic Emirate in the future. That includes humanitarian aid, that includes potential investments from countries like China and Russia, who still continue to criticize the Taliban that they're not an inclusive system. So despite the news that we keep reading about how much Russia and China are doing there, it comes with significant caveats. And one of the things that have, of course, come up out of this is Taliban influences. There are people that used the fall of Kabul in August 21 to really bolster their public profiles. They gathered tens and thousands of new followers. A lot of people did celebrate the Taliban coming into power. They used these moments to become sort of these quasi voices of the Taliban, again, largely on Twitter. And it's a very bizarre system because a lot of them also sort of market themselves as somewhat autonomous, that they support the Taliban, but they're not the Taliban. The couple of influencers, for example, that used to comment, and I used to watch this every day, used to comment every day under Elon Musk's Twitter account that he should buy Twitter, because they thought that they would get a fairer voice if Twitter was bought by Elon Musk. And this is before the purchase, of course, and purchase happened later on. But so there is this sort of entire new ecosystem that has developed under the Taliban. And it is largely sort of according to their whims and fancies. But how sort of, there is a realization with the Taliban as well that they cannot control all of it, which is concerning because Taliban is not a homogeneous movement. It's not a homogeneous Islamic Emirate, and it's definitely not a homogeneous interim government. All right. So one of the most important things that they are marketing online is the Islamic Emirates branding, right? It's literally everywhere. I was very surprised to see it on the Wikipedia page of Afghanistan now. I'm not sure if they're recognizing it by themselves, but they have a caveat in place saying that it's contested whether the Taliban is the actual government or not. But the page now shows the Taliban flag, the Taliban emblem, and that raises a very interesting question for Wikipedia. Are they legitimizing something that is not legitimized by the UN or any other state? Even the countries that have allowed Taliban diplomats to come and open embassies there have technically said that they do not recognize it. So, although getting sort of envoys is a sort of recognition. So the Taliban sort of the image of the Islamic Emirate has become extremely, extremely important and critical of how they are portraying themselves online. And on a more sort of anecdotal takeaway, because we haven't done enough work on this yet, but we are looking at this imagery and the marketing of this imagery as feeding into a level of normalization that they want. When we're talking about humanitarian issues, for example, when they say that, look, you're not giving us the required humanitarian aid, people are starving, people are dying. All this, when it's published, when it's pushed out into the digital world, it comes with the iconography of the Taliban sort of imagery next to it. And I do see slowly people buying into it now, right? They are saying, oh, we should not hold back X, Y, Z so that ABC can benefit in Afghanistan. But of course, the Taliban is a group that is never happy with anything. So they will always take more and then demand more without giving up anything. So, but we do see that kind of sort of messaging that is taking place now, specifically considering how fatigued the West is on issues such as Afghanistan at this point, that there is space for to concede. And they are working very hard with their digital communication to access that space, especially when it comes to finances and humanitarian aid and so on and so forth. So, and this goes back to issues such as, for example, I don't know if people follow this, the blue tick thing in February, when they managed to buy blue ticks for about, well, we counted 23 accounts. I'm not sure how many actually did that. And from what I gather, Afghanistan, you could not buy blue ticks, but they use someone else's credit card. I don't know. Yeah. To get those, and only after there was hue and cry on Twitter were they taken off. So that also shows that when sort of new programs are launched on something like Twitter, which is very sort of I'm not sure how to put it right now, but on the move, is it? That a lot of these concerns are actually not being thought of. So it is very sort of business oriented for the time being, but how non-state militant actors, for example, are going to use these new facilities, whether for their benefit or not, and how they're going to sort of feed into the output that some of these entities are doing, is not being thought of. And of course, this is just we are just talking about the Taliban right now. The normalization of the Taliban has allowed a whole sort of smorgasbord of online content being released around groups like TTP, for example, and the amount of sort of propaganda that is coming out of TTP right now is immense. We talk about it very little because it's very regional, it's hyper local at times, but it's everything from podcasts to GIFs to videos. To, all of it is there when it comes to the TTP. There's very little on Al-Qaeda because I think the Taliban realizes that if Al-Qaeda suddenly breaks out, the entire interest is going to come back to them. So somehow they're managing that. Of course, Al-Qaeda by itself is also quite debilitated at this point. But TTP is something that has patronage of the Taliban. And their online output is absolutely immense, specifically on Twitter and some other platforms as well. And this is not something that I've actually come across being debated, for example. Just the amount of propaganda that the TTP is releasing. It is largely against Pakistan at this point of time, which is already in political turmoil. But if you see both the TTP and of course ISKP, that continues to release propaganda magazines, videos, and so on, largely targeting now Central and South Asian states, because they do realize beyond a point that the whole narrative of attacking the West, especially from a place like Afghanistan, really doesn't exist anymore. So it may be sort of slow on the international front when it comes to online propaganda with Islamist groups, but certainly the sort of the newer ones that have been empowered over the past year specifically are very, very active, especially in these Central Asian and South Asian states. So very quickly, so just going back to the ISKP propaganda. Of course, one of the things that they're doing in ISKP right now is trying to insert them in communal divisions, in theological divisions, and in societal divisions in these states, which used to be done sort of as broader ISIS propaganda earlier, but is now much more targeted. Whenever sort of, let's say, for example, a communal event happens in India, there's always something out within a couple of minutes on certain channels, basically saying that, look, this is what we've been always telling you. You need to rise up against these entities. You need to rise up against this leadership or political party, and so on and so forth. And this has been a trend for a while now. Voice of Khorasan is a magazine that has been doing this since South al-Hind was shut down. And Voice of Khorasan is a very strange entity. It really pivots between really badly made content and really well-made content. So that also shows sort of a level of a challenge on how quick can they be when certain events take place from a regional point of view, and what kind of capacity they actually have. Because South al-Hind was the original magazine that they had, which shut down for reasons unknown. And Voice of Khorasan sort of came on much later, and there's a very similar template to it. But is slightly more well done than South al-Hind. But of course, there are multiple languages also that a lot of this propaganda now comes in, especially languages targeting South Indian states. and the scale of multilingual propaganda, especially targeting South and Central Asia, is still not very comprehensive. But we do see that it is increasing slowly, as, for example, on an Indian case, as elections come close next year. So, so they, these guys are sort of targeting political events, especially democratic events, where they want to try and sort of insert themselves as narratives that may shift how people think politically and how people act politically. And for example, one of the things that has happened over the past 30 days specifically is that a lot of time when Voice of Khorasan targets India, it was during lull periods of political events elsewhere. So right now, for example, there's so much happening in Pakistan. We can actually see that there is a significant drop in anti-India propaganda that they are publishing. So they are very cognitive of what to target when and what to target where. I haven't seen any major sort of shifts in the sense that of them practically changing anything on the ground in the places that they're targeting. But that doesn't mean that it's ineffective. So because there are increased instances of such communal events across the South Asian space, there is a possibility. It only takes one case to sort of fuel something. So this is very quickly sort of something that came out in Voice of Hind, which was debated a lot because India had banned an organization in late 2022 called the PFI. The PFI, of course, says that they're a fully legit entity. They're a societal entity. They're a political entity as per under Indian laws. But their ban was followed by a fairly long, very well articulated response published by Voice of Khorasan, to the point where I've never seen anything written so well before. So that raised a lot of questions within India that how did this sudden sort of shift came? Who wrote it? Why did they write it immediately after the PFI was banned? And that sort of also legitimized what the Indian government was doing within public discourse. So almost as a counterproductive to what these guys were hoping to do. But if you do get your hands on it, it's a very interesting read, especially when it comes to quality of political discourse within such propaganda. And finally, just take you to what kind of responses we have seen to these increased propaganda outlets. India earlier this month banned 14 apps. Most of these I never heard of, but it included Snapchat initially, which was then dropped later on. But the others were banned as part of an anti-terror move. And this is largely because first, a lot of these apps used technologies beyond the ambit of what the Indian security system understands. So a lot of these apps were using Bluetooth or for messaging and not necessarily using Wi-Fi or 3G and normal sort of internet technologies. And the other thing is, of course, it showcased a significant lack of capacity building and a significant lack of being able to stay at par with where technology is going, especially for a large country like India, which has a large bureaucracy and a large security system. So banning is just easier than building capacities quickly to counter these things. And it's not just we've banned apps previously as well. India is also very high, probably number one right now in internet bans altogether. There's no quantifiable data that says this works, but the authorities have decided it works. So they are continuing it. And the internet ban is, of course, has been, as it happens, has been expanded to other things, such as trying to stop cheating in exams. But the only thing that we came to a consensus about these bans it's largely based around the insurgencies in Kashmir. And Kashmir is divided by a disputed line of control. That means that whenever terrorism activities have happened, SIM cards from two countries have actually gone across the borders. So it's not necessary that if you try to sort of ban a telephone number in India, it's going to stop their access because they may be using a different company that's actually not from that country. Again, that does not mean that the banning of apps works, but that's largely comes down to capacities. And there is no sort of domestic move in both understanding and acting against terror propaganda in general, because that takes huge capacities to build, that takes access to researchers, which the Indian state is not very used to. And that's something that they've decided is far too long frame. Banning is right then and there, and that's easier to sort of implement. So I'll just quickly stop there.
Thank you so much. I think we've taken the entire audience around the world and then some, both virtually and geographically. It was really interesting. I mean, you covered a lot around the terrain, not only in, I think Taliban is a really interesting case study for us to discuss in that it's not officially designated by the UN or the US. And maybe to Hannah's point, that makes it harder to legally tell tech companies to take harsher action. So we saw that some tech companies did ban the Taliban based on their own violent extremist or terrorist policies, and others that have a more list-based approach or limited capacities did not outright ban the Taliban because there was no legal designation by governments to do so. I think in the UN, there's over 130 something entities related to the Taliban that are in fact sanctioned and designated, but not the Taliban in and of itself. So they've tried to chip away, but not directly get at the problem there. And then what you're talking about of just internet shutdowns, I think last year GNET published a longer report, not only stating why internet shutdowns and bans did not, in fact, counter terrorism, but was counterproductive and had a lot of human rights risks. So if you haven't read that one, go back and to see where the GNET publications have come up before. We have a lot of healthy questions. I'm going to start with a round of questions for everyone based on the virtual and then go to our IRL audience that we have before us to make sure that Matt and Hannah are not atrophying. We'll do a round for you based on some of the questions that we see here. And then I think there's some, Meili, there's one particular to maybe your research that some can chip in on, then one to Kabir and Meili. So for Hannah and Matt, and I'll just kind of read through it and you can kind of take from these questions since they have overlaps to them. But there's some questions from our Q&A online about one, just the relationship between the Great Replacement theory and white genocide. Are these being considered very much intertwined as we might think, or do we see that there's some divergence within that? And speaking kind of in relation to some of that, where does white masculinity in particular take a role when we talk about maybe accelerationism and this concept of societal decay or dirtiness and the need for purification? Where does that masculinity play? And related to that, there was a question about kind of, I don't think we can necessarily call everything incel. Not everyone is involuntarily celibate that is a misogynist, but where does that misogyny-based violent extremism come into play? And a question related is, do we just generally see misogyny being mainstreamed a bit more? And the question in here pointed to individuals like Andrew Tate that we have a lot of young men idolizing, or Jordan Peterson. So where does misogyny fit in? And there's a last question about the saints culture. There's some great GNET insights and reports about sainthood, about the idea of this glorification of lone actor shooters. And the question is about divergence in the online space, because the questioner noted that, in fact, there are also conspiracy theories that say that some of these lone actors are in fact agents of the government, that Brenton Tarrant was in fact an agent of the government. So where do we see the fact that we often talk about white supremacy spaces or violent extremist far right spaces as if they're a little bit homogenous, but in fact, there might be this heterogeneity. So I'm going to start with you guys on that, and then for you guys to think and percolate on afterwards, just if you want to prep. In the meantime, there is a question back to researcher safety, especially for women or ethnic minorities in this space, since there tends to be extra targeting in the online space. It costs very little to target and harass online. compared to the psychological stress you then get when you are targeted harassed. So any tips for early career researchers or resources that we want to point to? I might jump in on that one. I know we have some really good ones there as well. And then more broadly, just a question of, we have a lot of, maybe in the white supremacy space, groups that found themselves online, but actually when we talk about some of the Islamist extremist space or the broader Asian region and MENA space, we're talking about groups that were established offline, but then found sanctuary or propagandizing in the online space. How dependent are these groups on those online spaces, given that they weren't founded online, they were founded in real localized offline efforts and then found other tactics and usage in the online space? Okay. Hannah and Matt, a lot for you to chew on and nibble on, and any which way you want to take some of those buckets of questions, and then I'll turn it over to Kabir and Meili.
Thanks for it.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you.
We're going to start with really big questions about toxic masculinity and whiteness. Yeah. No, I think if we sort of pick backwards, we can get to a couple of main points that maybe cut across all of those questions you threw out, and that's masculinity that has a violent or supremacy notion to it is present in the vast majority of what we're seeing, both in the accelerationist space and then the broader violent extremist landscape today. But post-ideological, mixed ideological, uncertain, or however the framework you had earlier was, Andrew Tate's a really good example of that. He converted to Islam. I think it was right before he was arrested in Romania. So there's these elements that keep coming to play where things like that look like a lot of the post-ideological landscape that drives these unusual manifestations of violence, right? And at the core, over and over again, we see this notion of supremacy, but specifically male supremacy. And one of the ways that's been present a lot in the accelerationist space is that these sort of, we have to talk about this as it's not about anything after the collapse. It's about the collapse. Get to the collapse, everything else is icing on the cake, right? But in reality, there are core strains of individual belief systems where there are favored outcomes after that collapse. And one of them is a very rigid, male-driven hierarchical society. I mean, that's just an element of what has gone into both fascism and these sort of post-fascist ideologies that drive a lot of accelerationists. So I'd say like that sort of the dynamic between the social decay and the masculinity, or the white masculinity or white supremacy element of that violent masculinity as a whole, they're intertwined, and it kind of, it's hard sometimes to tell which one spurs the other, right? Is it the toxic masculinity that gives one a white supremacist framework, or the other way around? And that, I think that leads a little bit towards the great replacement theory and the white genocide dynamics. Everybody keeps trying to add their own flavor on a lot of this because the goal is to be an influencer, right? You need to build an audience. And the best way to do that in today's digital inspired realm of where you're making connections is to be an influencer. Again, going back to Andrew Tate, he got very popular because he was able to capture a specific set of apps to really build his brand and make him who he was. And that, I think when we talk about specifically like the great replacement theory and how that plays off of folks like Tate and other spaces that they're working with, everyone can find something that they can agree with, and if they don't like it, they'll find a way to disagree with it, but still retain the core concept, right? So great replacement theory and white genocide may sometimes be at odds with one another, but at other times they fit perfectly together like two pieces of a puzzle. It just depends on who's talking, what they're advertising, what they're selling as a brand. I think when we talk about the saints culture, like the sort of dissenting elements of people, like they're agents of the government, there's always, especially in fascist spaces, there's always going to be someone that thinks that the government's actually behind everything, right? It's never going to be a factor where you don't have individuals that are going to say you're a Fed, or you're something else that makes you not authentic. It is a fact of these communities. So I don't put a whole lot of weight behind it. I think it's actually something that is maybe to be expected to be balanced out in the end, but it doesn't really change the fact that the vast majority of individuals that buy into the saints culture, or any of these other conspiracy theories for that matter, they still have this realm of activity between embracing it and sort of becoming skeptics, that they still can be mobilized to violence, and that's what's really concerning.
Thanks for that. And Hannah, did you want to riff off that and build off some of those questions?
Yeah, I mean, the questions are all really interesting, and they ask effectively the big questions, which is how does this relate to this, and all these different kind of online ecosystems interacting. That's exactly the point, right? It's you can't say this is the ideological program of this group and this is the ideological program of this group, and here are the incels and here's the lines of where the incels stop, and here are all the white supremacists and here's where that stop, and then we have our great replacement people over here and our white genocide people over here.
It'd be so much easier.
Wouldn't it? Exactly. We all love to put things in boxes, but it doesn't really work. So I guess in answer to all the questions, what's the difference? Sometimes there is a difference and sometimes there isn't, and people increasingly just look at things which are violent and are supremacist in whatever way the perpetrator finds a way of supremacizing themselves, if you will. So I think all those questions really picked up on one of the points that I was trying to get across. I think, having said that, some ecosystems are more specific than others. Inceldom is a very specific online ecosystem, but that doesn't mean that the core drivers of misogyny, extreme misogyny, aren't present across lots of different groups and ecosystems and networks. And I think the Andrew Tate question is really interesting. Anecdotally, I've been doing more and more work on looking at young people involved in extremism, and a lot of schools come and say, we're very worried about Andrew Tate. It's the main thing people are worried about, you know, again, is it that's what the news is about, that's what the community knows about, or is it increasingly that we're seeing these people who are being able to act as gateways into online extremist ecosystems? And this brings me on to a whole other point about borderline content and legal but harmful content, and one which I won't get into now necessarily, but I can. So yes, overall, agree with a lot of what Matt said. And I think this kind of diversification is really the key point to drive home here.
Yeah, I think related to that, there's this bigger question that keeps being asked of whether or not misogyny is a gateway drug to other types of violent extremism, or if it's a violent extremism in and of itself. And I believe Maddie Cannon wrote a pretty good insight about that, arguing that while it is prevalent across many different violent extremist ideologies, it can also be a violent extremist ideology in and of itself, as we've seen with some individual attackers like in Santa Barbara and elsewhere, where that was the primary ideological drive. Go talk to Maddie as well afterwards if you want to target somebody. Meili, I might turn over to you, because within all of this, you know, we ourselves as researchers take on risk. So maybe you want to comment a little bit about either some things that you wish you'd known as an early career researcher that we can't take back now, but maybe we don't have to pass on that same PTSD to others, like maybe some good resources, or how to safeguard as we research in this space, especially as often we're the ones going down deep, dark, scary rabbit holes purposefully, but not always given structural guidance. Usually academic institutes, NGOs, governments, they are lacking, they're behind, they're not always understanding the spaces that we're diving into. So maybe if you have any comments from some of your research on how to safeguard, things you wish you'd known early on, or where we should be pointing people that are also doing this research.
So I think just personally, one of the things I wish I had known immediately was just general online safety protocol. Because when I started looking at the IS spaces, I had really supportive supervisors, and you know, I was really grateful for this. And this was outside of academia, by the way. But a lot of us, like actually none of us, we had never been on Telegram. But I went and I asked, you know, would it be okay to explore the angle of looking at extremists online, you know, just to better understand, like couple that with academic literature, you know, really excellent journals reports, and then myself see, okay, you know, what are the primary source documents, what's actually happening in these spaces. So when I first went there, I had like basic online knowledge, but then looking back on it now, I realized how dangerous it could have been. Like it was very haphazard, kind of go into the deep end of the pool and jump in and just go, okay, you know, without really knowing how to swim very well. And it's a constant learning process too regarding online safety. So I think like, at least my perspective, I think online safety, before you even touch this stuff, like definitely get a grasp on the basics of it. Like you don't have to get super complicated, but you know, just the awareness of general online safety protocols. And I think there's a resource that's online, it's electronic Foundation.
Frontiers Foundation.
Yeah, Electronic Frontiers Foundation. I actually mixed it up with Electronic Horizons Foundation, which is an IS. I'm like, oh my God. But yes, Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF. They have some excellent resources, so definitely check them out. And there's also other resources available, but that's just the one that immediately comes to mind for me. And then just other general tips that I jotted down that came to mind were, you know, talk to others who have actually done this work. I wish I had done that, you know, but back then it was just kind of new in general, but it would have been helpful to talk to people like, what was your experience? How did you get into it? How did you, like safeguard, yourself online, and also even like recognize signs of burnout, because I think it comes with any job, not just this job, right? Like any job can have burnout, and it's good to recognize when you're starting to hit the limit. Also just have, gauge personal comfort levels with risk that you're definitely going to come across. Like there are inherent risks to any job really, but to this one with terrorism related risk, whether that's exposure to violent content, like I didn't really even think about the type of stuff I might see online from the IS spaces. And yeah, I guess I wasn't super shocked, like it's, Islamic State, it's very violent and it will post these things, but I had never seen that stuff before, and it's not anything that even crossed my mind. So maybe just think about that depending on the space you're looking at, like what are the worst things that you can expect to come across? Not that you will, but what can you expect? Also, search yourself and your family online, like do some self-OSINT, do some open source intel to see what can be found about you and your family before you start this stuff. Also, like what support mechanisms are available? You should ask yourself this question. And I think being in an institution, it offers a lot of privilege, but if you're an independent researcher, that's especially important to ask, because there are much more limited resources if you're independent, and it can be, I understand it can be really difficult. So just kind of understand the inherent, things that might be available to you through this. And then also understand personal boundaries, and do you want to have time limits on this stuff? Do you only want to look at it in the day and not before bed? Some people are okay with looking at, around the clock, and that's fine. It's just what is comfortable for you, and then also again, like consider your research positionality. And so again, everyone is facing risk, but if you're a woman, you might get targeted for certain reasons. If you're a woman of color, person of color, if you're Muslim, Jewish, whatever, basically, these extremists will target certain aspects of your identity, especially if you're doing public research. So just understand how comfortable are you with that. And, I think you should actually be in the mindset to expect this. It may not happen. Hopefully it doesn't, but at least hope for the best, prepare for the worst. So.
Thank you so much. And I believe, to carry on this discussion from the Q&A, we do have a researcher mental health panel tomorrow. So we wanted to make sure we had dedicated time for this. And just to kind of piggyback on some of the things you mentioned, I know that GIFCT, we have a positive interventions working group that some of you are in. And last year we had authors, including Galen, working with Kesa White and Jacob Davey, who are in the room. I'm singling everyone out so that people can targeted benevolent harass you in the coffee break. But they actually wrote a paper about what resources exist, mental well-being considerations, largely pointing to other sectors that aren't counterterrorism. So like the journalist space has a lot about personal protection, or just when you see more people that do intervention work for humanitarian aid, we actually pulled from other sectors for where we could find this. And then actually, when you look at tech companies, they've evolved this space for moderators, although we can talk about the pros and cons of moderation and protocols, but even just things like what makes it less cognitively abrasive, like turning everything into black and white and not actually having to watch every single second of that beheading video, because unless you really need to do that for your critical thinking, do you need to engage it in its most visceral aspect? So just basic fingernails instead of the entirety of a video or bedtime hours. I know Voxpol, violent online extremism and politics. Voxpol also did a series on mental health and researcher well-being. So I will plug anywhere that exists. And I think we have an author in the room that for GNET is looking at researcher trauma. There you go. Another benevolent harassment, and actually doing cognitive work on how the content affects researchers. And it all had ethical approval. All GNET out, because you can't just be like, does this traumatize you? Great data, bad ethics. So everything is ethically approved. So I'll plug those things, and I know that this will carry on into tomorrow. Kabir, maybe jumping between you and Meili, like this question of how much are these groups that really have their foundations in the offline space, but are using online tools, how much are they dependent? Like if Twitter got shut down in Afghanistan, do they care? Do they not? Where have people become overly reliant on this online space for community propagandizing, politics, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, so coming back to the same thing, that I don't think it's going to matter much. Let's say hypothetically Twitter gets shut down, and going back to the same thing, right? They were the Taliban influencers were very sort of tweeting at Elon Musk that you should buy it because it was going to benefit what they think is a safe.
Maybe that's why he bought it. It tipped him over the scale, right?
Yeah. No. Well, they're becoming a good client anyway. But so I think it is extremely important for someone like the Taliban, because they are going in that movement from an insurgency to a state. And they have to sell that, right? And as I said, the way they're selling it is also sort of being bought by some people. So in some way, if you, let's say, hypothetically shut it down tomorrow, that movement that they're currently doing of being an insurgency and moving towards an acceptable state or a normal state will get significantly hampered as far as sort of communicating with the outside world is concerned, because they don't get platform anywhere else. It's very rare for them to come on CNN or BBC or whatever it is, right? And even if they do come on BBC, for example, right now, it's largely on, oh, why are you not allowing girls to go to school, right? So they have that sort of output where they do talk about it, but on this side is whatever they want to talk about. And that division is very important to them. So if you actually shut it down overnight, I think that's going to tremendously hurt of what they are trying to do at this point in time.
Did you want to jump in on that as well? Just kind of, that's the Taliban, where we've seen maybe Islamic State and Al-Qaeda become hyper dependent. Like even these publications are in the digital space. They're not usually printed out and sent around like Vogue or Financial Times or whatever else. Spectrum of publications.
Yeah, so I think for IS supporters and AQ supporters as well, it would be very important for the individuals who are isolated. So where areas where you have more of the regional focus and regional, in-person involvement, maybe it would not impact this too much. But when it comes to the isolated supporters around the world, if they cannot access IS content, if they can't get the AQ magazine, the latest issue of AQ content, they search wildly online already. But if you remove this access, they might further feel isolated and really disconnected from the community. And there are some, just as subjective observations, but, for example, some just, a tidbit of examples of individuals online who talk about feeling, like at home, they have no support. Their, family doesn't even know they support white supremacist causes or ISAQ, whatever. And then finding the community in that home online. So it's basically exclusive and online socializing process. So it would matter greatly to them, but to the groups themselves, I mean, especially when you see more of like regional focus, like from ISKP, it seems like it can vary just depending on the entity and the individuals.
I almost sense like the empathy, like they'd be really isolated from their community. I'm like, that's a good thing, right? Like we don't want them.
It's a good
Totally.
scary, like will they pop off? And
Right.
they're like, I'm so frustrated. So it's hard to predict it. But
Right.
You just quickly to add, Maldives is a very good example in South Asia, because it per capita had the highest number of people that joined Islamic State. And for the longest period of time, you never heard Maldives in most ISIS propaganda. But like Voice of Khorasan, even Sautal Hind earlier, had separate sections for it, because they realized that the readership is actually quite high. And if the readership is acting on it, on what they're reading. So they did move on how they developed their content in accordance to where it was working. And Maldives is actually very sort of, it's not research enough, but it is a very interesting sort of example of how that worked out.
So we actually saw the inter-engagement of responding to online analytics and the measurement and evaluation for targeting audiences, which we usually think of in terms of PV and CV, but looks like everyone's learning from each other. Okay, in real life audience, I'm going to take some buckets of 3 questions at a time so we can chunk them so that authors, we have just about 15 minutes left. So raise your hands, and we've got roaming mics going on. Any questions from in real life audience? We've got 1, we've got 2, we've got 3. I'm going to make you get your step count up and go all the way tic-tac-toe across the rooms, or we could just pass back as we go.
Hi, thanks everyone. So I just had a question.
Oh, and I'm going to say, if you say name and affiliation, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. Broderick McDonald's, ICSR in Oxford. And I just had a question for the last 2 panelists, Kabir and Meili. So when we talk about Taliban mainstreaming, I'm also interested in other non-state actors, Salafi jihadist groups that are becoming state actors now. So I've just gotten back from field work in Syria, where you have Nusra, HTS now becoming a state government. In Mali, you see the same thing. And in these cases, you have 4 or 5 million civilians, depending on the information that these Salafi jihadist groups are putting out. And yet, they are listed jihadist groups by the United States, the EU, United Nations. What do you think the response of tech companies and platforms should be to these these non-state actors that are becoming state actors, especially when they include, explicit terrorist content in much of that mix of humanitarian, governance, normal content that they put out. They'll also include extremist content in there as well.
Great question. We'll have you pass that over to Galen. And even when you say that, Hamas and Hezbollah, also state Iranian Guard Corps designated a couple of years ago, state entities or state-backed entities that are now on US or wider designations. Galen.
Thanks. This is the microphone catching game.
Yeah.
Galen England, Extremism and Gaming Research Network. Great presentation. I have about 12 questions, but I'll stick to one of them. This is mostly for Matt and a bit for Hannah as well. I suppose this is mainly a question around whether or not we're seeing a mainstreaming of extremist ideas across society. So Matt, you mentioned the Great Replacement theory as one of your heuristics for looking at definitions of accelerationism and militant accelerationism. But as you know, in France, 6 out of 10 people believe the Great Replacement theory is real and intend to follow Eric Taner's notions there, right? So at what point do heuristics like that begin to blur into the background of societies that are increasingly shifting in many areas towards more extreme points of view? Similarly, in Germany, if you look at the Neue Kreuz movement, do you consider something like that as meeting your definition for militant accelerationism, or is that something else? And if it is something else, what do we call that? I guess, Hannah, when you mentioned the ideology of school massacres, ideology of school shootings, do you see an ideology there or not? Because I don't. And I'm curious where these kind of murky corners of general shifts in society began to blur into discrete extremist conceptions of ideology and how you would interpret it. Thanks.
Thanks, Galen. I'm going to do pass back.
Hello, Jenny Fisher, Department for Education. Please don't kill me. Promise I'm not the problem, I'm part of the solution. But it was a question essentially for, in a way, all of you. It's around kind of the consumption of violent content, particularly in those interested in extremism. I know, Hannah, you mentioned the case study around kind of the consumption of ISIS beheading videos. And to what extent do we see this as kind of a true ideological mixing, or is it just the desire to consume violent content? And essentially, at the risk of being relatively crude with it, ISIS are quite prevalent content creators when it comes to things like beheadings and other violent pieces as well. Thanks.
Great, that's a really nice smattering. And actually that's like one for you guys, one for you guys, one for everyone. So that works well. First question. So I'm gonna go Kabir and Meili on this one, just about what happens when either state entities become designated or when non-state entities that are designated become state entities, and how we should be thinking about that, especially for content regulation, what tech companies should do with it.
Yeah, that's a great and very difficult question, because one of the first things that when this started to happen, when they started to negotiate with the Taliban in Qatar, one of the first questions was, okay, if you do this, but then where do you stop? Right? And there's no clear answer to it now, because there is a level of normalization now that, and we saw soon after when the Taliban took over, we saw, Hezbollah congratulating them. The Taliban met Hamas last month in Qatar. So they all have taken this idea that, oh, this can be done and they can be defeated and we will do it, right? So, and that's a really, really bad precedent to set. And ultimately, it's very difficult to answer what tech companies should do, because technically, let's say from an Indian point of view, India's always said that you have to go by what our law is. So what we are banning, you should ban as well. And till a certain extent now, I'm presuming some people are happy about this in Delhi, that Elon Musk has started to sort of, do some of those things from an Indian perspective. So, it's going to be very, very, very tricky going forward, because there's even in a place like Kashmir, for example, one of the politicians, when India was thinking about opening dialogue with the Taliban, since it's a reality, and the question was, well, why aren't you talking to the insurgents here if you can talk to them there, right? So it's going to come down to how tech companies deal with a state's laws on these things, a state's designation. I don't think it will matter beyond the point what the UN thinks. I don't think it'll matter what a multilateral system decides on who's designated or who's not designated. As we go forward, I think most states will force or will ask tech platforms that, look, we have designated this ABC as a terror group. It's your now duty to stamp it out of your platform. And if you don't do, then there are X number of consequences legally or so on and so forth. So we are entering a very sort of gray area on that front.
I mean, I guess that gets extra tricky. I believe Russia designated Instagram as a violent extremist entity just the other year. And I think we also have examples of lots of designation lists that actually use terrorism to designate journalist networks or dissenting opposition parties. GIFCT did launch a definitions and principles site last year that talks about the pros, cons, and risk mitigations of applying designation lists, where as a company, you can't really go in and say, I want to be in your country, but I will not follow your law. And it gets very, very tricky. And we saw that with the designation of the Iranian Guard Corps in Iran, where Instagram was threatened to be kicked off because all of a sudden it was illegal to have Iranian Guard Corps people have platforms and presence. There's also a legislative map on that website, which shows that different governments are making legislations in the online space that are starting to conflict. So you might have some states that are really wanting free speech. And so they're saying you cannot remove this type of content, and other countries that are saying you absolutely have to remove this. And if you're in India and I'm in America and I find a piece of content in Australia and I post it to you, one post, 3 jurisdictions, we're getting very confusing very quickly. Meili, I don't know if you want to jump in on the back of that about, some of these entities now have state backing, some of them don't. How does that get tricky? What should tech companies do?
Oh yeah, I honestly do not have much to add because totally agree, such a gray area. But maybe one comparison, and it's just floating it out there. I'm not sure if it's like a great idea, quite frankly, but the way that politicians have tweeted very violent things, like they are as people, like they have these accounts, but you can't like ban the people unless they do something really awful, I suppose. But maybe target certain tweets that are super violent, like you can get rid of that content, and then maybe from there debate what should be done about how to handle that entity by case basis.
That's a really good one. I know that tech companies are grappling, when do you go by a list-based approach and when do you go by a behavior and content focus-based approach, which helps us get it to at least the more overt violent or extremist content. Hannah and Matt, don't think we forgot about you. You are on the hot seat for the next one, just about back to this idea of the mainstreaming of violent extremist rhetoric, the ideologies around great replacement theory. Maybe one for you about like school shooters ideology. What is that? Where do we actually place that? Even though your whole point is we'd still need to place it somewhere. So I don't know if you guys want to riff off that. Maybe start. You get to start. Yeah.
I thought I was going to get this question. Thank you. Very good question. Agree overall. Firstly, it depends what you think an ideology is the first question. And that might be quite an academic pursuit. And it's quite difficult to talk to security services or policing about this, because from their perspective, it's, are they going to try and shoot a school? Yes or no? So it's quite difficult to get this question heard in these kind of forums. I think personally, I don't think school shooter glorification, let's say, is necessarily an ideology, but sometimes it does present as an ideology in the way in which people adhere to it, and the kind of glorification, sainthood mechanisms, many of which we see with accelerationism and other types of content in violent extremist online forums. As I showed before, the UK government calls it types of concern. Again, it's just another phrase for something which we're not really sure what it is and what the best phrase for it is.
So British framing, types of concern.
Yeah, it's quite the understatement. So I think there really needs to be a big piece done on this, and what the role of ideology in violent extremism is, and can still be considered terrorism if you don't think it's specifically an ideology, and if you don't think they have any kind of program at all. And to answer the final question as well, relating to kind of IS beheading videos, I don't think it's particularly uncommon to see this kind of that kind of content on extreme right channels. Typically, it might be from more of a operational perspective, learning the different tactics which a magazine might be promoting, for example. That's not necessarily an indicator of ideological mixing, but also it might be. It's probably a case-by-case basis situation, which is always a really unhelpful answer when you're trying to get at broad overall trends, which I think this panel is, but case by case basis is probably the way to go in that scenario. Some people have called these type of things post-ideological. Again, that's quite an academic-y term, and I think we really need to have a go at distilling this kind of content this kind of idea in a way which security services and governments and policymakers can listen to and understand and process, and focus more on the kind of types of content and the commonalities across the content rather than the specific issues themselves. To have a go at the mainstreaming question as well, I'm going to answer by talking about anti-Semitism, because that is what I research day to day. Anti-Semitism is an extremist attitude, whether it appears on the mainstream, on the extreme right, on the extreme left, all over the political spectrum. So in terms of mainstreaming, it is mainstreamed, it exists everywhere. I think the expression of anti-Semitism is often what differs, and whether it's used overtly, covertly, whether the perpetrator or the person using this language is themselves otherwise an extremist. But again, for a Jewish person or someone looking from a security perspective, the perpetrator of anti-Semitic narratives is academic. Someone's screaming abuse at you, whether they sit on a fringe party or in mainstream politics, the impact on the community is the same. I think it's difficult because people don't really understand what anti-Semitism is. People don't always know they're being anti-Semitic or think of themselves as anti-Semitic, even when they are expressing anti-Semitic thoughts. But of course, that is different across different, whether you're looking at anti-Semitism or misogyny or different forms of hatred, and they're expressed in different ways. But often you'll find the exact same attitudes expressed in different ways on the mainstream and the extreme. And the only difference is it's how we think about that person otherwise, but the impact on the community is often the same.
I'm definitely reminded of Poplar and just the concept of the tolerance of intolerance and where that ends up leading us. Matt, leaving you with Poplar, but I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so 1 to 2 minutes just on touching on that. What are you seeing in terms of mainstreaming? Especially, you even mapped out some of these groups that are trying to hide their intent and mainstream purposefully to not get taken down. And maybe also, how do you see in this space the overlap of just where is it gore enthusiasts? Where is it tactical consumption of violent content? And then maybe end with Meili on that, because I think you're looking at a lot of the same.
Yeah, I think when there's a lot of great questions being wrapped into one concept to answer here, but I think there's one very particular phrase that might capture all of it in one go, and that's the idea of a cultural script. And I really apologize, I don't remember who was the author of that paper, but I will send it to anybody that wants it after this. But the idea basically is that there are different things out there, such as conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement, or things like school shooter glorification, that can act as a script by which an individual can become associated with a new cultural framework. So these behaviors, because these concepts, whether it's the embrace of the Great Replacement theory in one cultural context versus another, right, that can maybe blur the lines of what is it or what do we call it. Each of these social fabrics that they're pulling on in those spaces, whether it's a digital ecosystem or the offline ecosystem that the digital space is referring to, they have a cultural relevancy, not just to that space in which they're operating geographically, like in the real world, but also into the community they're trying to build themselves. So if we think about things like school shooters, which there's actually a lot of accelerationist activity within school shooter fandoms, by the way, if you're not familiar with that, I'd love to talk about that afterwards. But we know for a fact that school shooter communities online are developing their own spaces in groups effectively. True crime communities have grown up into this sort of obsessive research identity around school shootings, and they blur the line there with, are they glorifying it when they do some of these activities? They're building these new behavioral pathways that individuals can follow on a user's journey of whether they're on Instagram or anywhere else. And in doing so, that's a script that others can follow behind them. So they're building this cultural script, right? And that's kind of what the Saints culture is in a lot of ways. It's a lot of what we see with the emulation of certain, or the use, I should say, of certain conspiracy theories by groups like active clubs, which is a great way to answer your question more directly. Germany and France, two very different cultural contexts that have the same narratives being used, different understandings of what that construct is in the Great Replacement or whatnot. But what we see is it's a tool that individuals and groups like active clubs, a neo-fascist street fighter, very much pro-identity masculinity space, they're using it as a way to build cross-cultural connections, right? And the way they do that is they mobilize the script of what that narrative and construct is into behaviors, both online and offline. And so in doing so, they're building a new cultural pathway for individuals to follow. So if we go back to other elements like the consumption of that gore or tactical, any of those kind of questions that feed into this space, some of this is pre-ideological, right? We're starting to see ideology build around these spaces. And that's where that cultural script identity or idea comes into play. And then others are pushing beyond that ideological space. They don't need an ideology to be effective, because what it is, it's behaviors that people are picking up on, whether it's gore or tactical content online they're consuming. It can still find its way into all these other avenues of the cultural identities being built. So when we really ask ourselves, you know, I think Meili, you said it was this malleable ideological edges, right? That was what you're, yeah. And we don't need to have firm understandings of these ideological spaces or whether or not the definition fits perfectly, if we can look across all of it and say they're sharing certain narratives, and with those narratives come certain behaviors, and that provides a script for any random person on the planet to be introduced to it and then mobilize to violence within, say, 6 months. And that's something that's very much at the forefront of what the platforms are trying to deal with. Is it doesn't really matter where you come from, whether you're a person that's trying to be a jihadist, but you're suddenly seeing white supremacist stuff in your Telegram channel, to the other way around. There's a reason for that. There's a pathway people are building. How do we disrupt that? That's really the bigger question at hand.
I don't know if in 30 seconds you wanted to riff off that before we wrap up, Meili, but just I know you're looking at similar overlaps in content types.
Yes, sure. I can make it super quick. So I think just to build on, what everyone else said about the ideological, is it ideological mixing overall, or is it a general desire for violence? I think it can be both, and it can depend on the person themselves. So, maybe there are personal factors, and, of course, not a psychologist, but, like maybe certain, preferences for violence, because somehow it like you just enjoy that, and that's like in another field, of course. So that might be one factor. Another would be, using it as an aesthetic tactic by inserting Islamic State beheading videos, for example, in a white supremacist channel, just being part of that overall siege edge culture type, edgy culture type vibe, and just really promoting the most violent stuff you can see to hold the attention of your audience. And then, again, just maybe even more generally outside of like accelerationism tactics or like that siege culture stuff, just being an inflammatory edgelord in general, like, even just on normal Facebook stuff, like normal Facebook communities, 4chan, you'll just find people going, oh, haha, IS beheading video or neo-Nazi flag, we'll pop this up here, just to get online internet points. So there's also, I think, that factor. And I'm sure there are others, but just in 30 seconds, those are just the ones that came to mind.
I think the terms I'm going to take away most from today are just the usage of edgelord, and I believe Southern Dixiecrats was one you might have to explain to non-USers in the room, but we're here for all the new terms and taxonomies. Please help me give a round of applause to our speakers. And thank you for those in the room, but also for those out in the ether on the interweb that were throwing in questions as well. I'm going to pass it back to Nicola, who is the director at GNET, to wrap up and give you the house cleaning for wrapping today and starting again tomorrow.
I promise you it will only be 20 seconds, just to make everyone's life easier. Thank you so much to our panel number one. Thank you for coming to our panel. And we will thank them all the way through, but a special thanks to Maddie Cannon for organizing.